Liam?
Awaken the maid in my heart, and you're dead.
Wake the maid on my chest, and you die. The arrogant Duke thought the ruthless Alpha King was joking. 5 minutes later, the marble floors ran red, and the lowest servant in the castle was handed the crown. Welcome to Luna's secret library. Sometimes the most unexpected turns lead us exactly where we need to be. What happens next is something I never saw coming, and I think you'll find it just as surprising. Stick around for the conclusion. It's a reminder that it's never too late for a new chapter. If you enjoy discovering these hidden gems, I'd be honored to have you follow for more. Clear, cinematic sunlight pierced the high-arched windows. It flooded the grand royal bedchamber with a brilliant, high brightness. Dust motes danced in the vivid morning beams. They settled softly upon the vast, silk-draped mattress. Chloe lay perfectly motionless. Her breathing was incredibly shallow and quiet. Her young, beautiful, and resilient face was pressed directly against a chest of warm, solid muscle. King Liam breathed in a steady, hypnotic rhythm beneath her. He was an alpha of striking, handsome features and a perfectly athletically built frame. There was no bulky, monstrous exaggeration to his immense strength. Instead, he possessed the lethal, quiet grace of a supreme predator at rest. Chloe knew deep down she did not belong in this magnificent room. She was merely a low-ranking castle maid. Her days were spent scrubbing heavy soot from the stone hearths. Her entire life had been defined by harsh scoldings and endless, invisible labor. Yet, after she collapsed from sheer exhaustion in the corridors last night, the king himself had carried her here. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors of the royal chamber burst open with a deafening crash. The harsh, violent noise instantly shattered the fragile peace of the morning. Chloe flinched violently in the massive bed. Her fiercely resilient spirit momentarily gave way to sheer, breathless panic. "My king," barked Duke Harrison. His heavy, ironclad boots stomped aggressively across the intricate woven rugs. "The Border Council demands your presence immediately." Chloe instinctively tried to scramble off the enormous mattress. She needed to kneel and fade back into the shadows where she belonged. But a firm, unyielding hand clamped securely around her narrow waist. Liam's arm locked her into place with the immovable, terrifying force of iron. He effortlessly pulled her back against his athletically built torso. A deep, terrifying rumble began to vibrate heavily through the alpha's chest. His piercing golden eyes snapped open. They instantly blazed with dangerous, untamed authority. The temperature in the brightly lit room seemed to plummet rapidly below freezing. "You dare enter my sanctuary uninvited," Liam stated. His voice was a low, lethal whisper that echoed off the ancient stone walls. Duke Harrison paused mid-stride. His arrogant gaze finally swept over the tangled silk sheets. He noticed the young, beautiful maid curled protectively against his sovereign. Disgust twisted the old nobleman's wrinkled face into a harsh, cruel sneer. "You delay urgent matters of state for a filthy servant girl," the Duke scoffed. His tone dripped with unapologetic venom and disdain. Chloe tightly closed her eyes. She felt the familiar, agonizing sting of humiliation wash completely over her. She was deeply accustomed to the daily cruelty of the High Court. She had survived their bitter torments with quiet, unbroken resilience for years. But to be humiliated here, wrapped intimately in the king's warmth, felt infinitely worse. Liam slowly pushed himself up against the headboard. He carefully kept Chloe entirely shielded behind his broad, strong shoulder. The clear, cinematic morning light perfectly illuminated the sharp, handsome angles of his furious jawline. He did not shout in uncontrolled anger. He did not raise his voice to lazily assert his royal dominance. "If you take one more step toward this bed," Liam said quietly. His steady tone was entirely devoid of mercy or hesitation. I will personally tear your throat out and feed it to the hounds." Duke Harrison froze completely in his tracks. The color drained rapidly from his weathered, arrogant cheeks. "My king, be reasonable, she is but a lowly." "She is resting," Liam coldly interrupted. The murderous intent burning in his golden eyes was absolute and undeniable. "And I gave strict orders to this entire castle regarding my morning peace." Chloe watched in absolute, breathless awe. The most powerful, terrifying man in the realm was ruthlessly defending her honor. No one in her entire difficult life had ever stood up for her. No one had ever considered her exhaustion, let alone thought her sleep was worth threatening a high lord. "Wake the maid on my chest, Harrison," Liam growled slowly. He barely parted his lips, exposing elongated, terrifying predatory fangs. "And you die." The absolute conviction in his chilling words sent a physical shockwave through the grand room. This was clearly not an idle, political threat. It was a sacred, unbreakable promise sealed in blood. The arrogant Duke backed away slowly and unsteadily. His trembling hands were raised in sudden, desperate surrender. He stumbled blindly out into the stone hallway, utterly terrified for his life. The heavy oak doors clicked shut. They plunged the royal chamber back into profound, ringing silence. Liam slowly turned his attention back to Chloe. His overwhelmingly dangerous aura melted away instantly into the bright morning air. His hardened expression shifted into something fiercely tender and incredibly protective. He gently brushed a stray lock of dark hair from Chloe's beautiful, stunned face. "Go back to sleep, little bird," he murmured softly. His large, rough thumb gently stroked the curve of her soft cheek. But Chloe's heart was racing far too fast for any true rest. She knew the vindictive, proud court would never forgive or forget this massive insult. By openly claiming a mere maid, the Alpha King had just implicitly declared war on his own powerful nobility. She heard the distant, hurried footsteps of the Duke echoing frantically down the corridor. He was undoubtedly rushing to spread the scandalous, explosive news to the rest of the ruling council. The entire kingdom would know by nightfall that their ruthless Alpha had lost his mind over a servant. They would whisper maliciously that she had used dark magic to bewitch him. They would immediately plot to remove her forever. They would see her as a terrible, fatal weakness in their otherwise invincible armor. Chloe shivered instinctively. The cold, terrifying reality of her dangerous new position settled heavily over her delicate shoulders. Liam felt her subtle tremble against his skin. He pulled her the rest of the way onto his strong lap. His immense body heat radiated outward, completely chasing away the sudden chill of her dark thoughts. "They will not touch you," Liam stated firmly. He easily read the absolute, paralyzing terror swirling in her wide eyes. "I will burn this entire castle to the ground before I let them harm a single hair on your head." His protective words were incredibly reckless. They were completely unbefitting of a wise, strategic ruler. Yet, they thrilled Chloe down to the very core of her resilient, hardened soul. For the first time in her lonely, invisible existence, she allowed herself to feel truly safe. She slowly rested her head back down against his wildly beating heart. The brutal war for the kingdom's future had just fundamentally shifted. It was beginning right here, silently, in this very bed. And the quiet, remarkably beautiful maid was unexpectedly holding the ultimate winning hand. She closed her eyes and let the bright, cinematic sunlight warm her back. Tomorrow, the real battle for survival would finally begin. The heavy oak doors remained firmly shut against the rising chaos outside. Inside the royal chamber, the clear, cinematic sunlight grew even more intense. It bathed the ancient stone walls in a stunning, high brightness. Chloe slowly sat up, carefully pulling the silk sheets up to her collarbone. Her beautiful and resilient face was still flushed with a mixture of awe and absolute terror. Liam stood near the towering window, staring out over his vast kingdom. He was fully dressed now in dark leather and polished silver armor. The fitted attire perfectly highlighted his athletically built and handsome frame. He looked incredibly lethal, yet there was nothing bulky or monstrous about his elegant posture. "They are gathering in the great hall," Liam said quietly. His sharp, golden eyes tracked the movement of distant carriages crossing the courtyard. "Duke Harrison has summoned the entire ruling council to challenge my sanity." Chloe felt a cold, terrifying knot tighten violently in her stomach. "You must go to them, my king," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "You must tell them I am nothing, just a passing, foolish mistake." She fully expected to be cast back down into the dark, soot-stained kitchens immediately. It was the only logical way to prevent a catastrophic civil war among the nobility. Liam turned slowly, his piercing gaze locking intensely onto her. He crossed the vast room with silent, predatory grace. He stopped at the edge of the bed and gently tilted her chin up. "I do not make mistakes, Chloe," he stated with absolute, terrifying conviction. "And I certainly do not hide what belongs to me." He snapped his fingers, and the side doors to the royal wardrobe swung open instantly. Two terrified senior maids scurried in, carrying a gown of deep emerald velvet. They avoided looking directly at the Alpha King, their hands shaking as they offered the dress. "Dress her," Liam commanded, his tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. Chloe was paralyzed with shock as the fine, heavy fabric was slipped over her thin shoulders. She had never touched anything so incredibly soft in her entire life. The rich emerald color perfectly contrasted with her pale skin and dark hair. It transformed the lowly servant into a breathtaking vision of quiet dignity. Liam offered his large, scarred hand to her. "Walk with me," he instructed gently. Chloe hesitated for a fraction of a second before placing her small fingers in his palm. He pulled her up effortlessly, and together they stepped out of the bedchamber. The grand castle corridors were flooded with clear, cinematic morning light. The high brightness of the hallway made it utterly impossible for them to hide in the shadows. Dozens of elite guards stood at absolute attention along the polished marble walls. Their eyes widened in sheer disbelief as they saw their ruthless sovereign approaching. He was openly holding the hand of a widely recognized kitchen girl. Scandalous whispers erupted like a sudden wildfire the moment they passed by. Chloe kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, forcing her breathing to remain perfectly steady. She channeled every ounce of her beautiful and resilient spirit just to keep walking forward. Liam's presence beside her was a towering, impenetrable fortress of pure strength. His athletically built and handsome form completely shielded her from the harshest, cruelest glares. He moved with a relaxed, lethal confidence, ignoring the murmurs entirely. They finally reached the towering, gold-leafed doors of the great hall. A heavy, oppressive silence hung ominously in the air just behind those doors. Chloe knew the most powerful, dangerous lords of the realm were waiting inside. They were ready to tear her apart verbally to protect their ancient, pure-blood traditions. Liam stopped and turned to face her, lightly brushing his thumb against her cheek. "Do not bow your head to anyone in this room," he ordered softly. "You answer only to me, and I bow to no one." He pushed the massive double doors open with a single, effortless shove. A blinding wave of high brightness poured into the dark, incredibly tense council room. Every aristocratic face turned toward them, twisted in varying shades of pure outrage. Duke Harrison stood at the head of the long table, his expression triumphant and arrogant. He mistakenly thought he had successfully cornered the young, reckless king. But Liam simply smiled, exposing the sharp, terrifying edge of his predatory fangs. He stepped confidently into the hostile room, pulling Chloe firmly to his side. The real war for her survival and his absolute authority had just officially begun. The massive doors of the great hall slammed heavily against the cold stone walls. A sudden flood of clear, cinematic sunlight instantly filled the massive room. The extreme high brightness violently exposed the angry, plotting faces of the royal council. Chloe tightened her grip nervously on Liam's large, scarred hand. She forced her beautiful and resilient face to remain perfectly neutral despite her internal panic. Liam led her confidently and slowly toward the exact center of the hostile room. He moved with the undeniable grace of an athletically built and handsome warlord. There was absolutely no hesitation in his firm, commanding steps across the marble floor. Duke Harrison slammed his fist violently against the heavy, ancient wooden table. "This is an absolute outrage, Your Majesty," the old nobleman shouted fiercely. "You dare bring a common kitchen maid into this sacred council chamber?" Other wealthy nobles immediately raised their voices in loud, angry agreement. They furiously demanded that Chloe be removed from the room at once. Some aggressive lords even demanded she be thrown into the dungeons for her sheer insolence. Liam did not raise his voice to shout over their pathetic, chaotic noise. He simply dropped Chloe's hand for a brief, terrifying moment. He walked slowly and deliberately toward Duke Harrison's elevated seat at the table. The entire room fell into a sudden, suffocating silence as the king approached. The clear, cinematic light caught the cold, deadly steel of Liam's sword hilt. He was clearly not a man of politics or endless, empty diplomatic debates. He had conquered this entire stubborn kingdom through pure, ruthless physical force. Duke Harrison tried desperately to maintain his arrogant, defiant posture. "You cannot simply ignore the ancient laws of the pureblood nobility," the Duke sneered openly. "She is nothing but dirt beneath our boots, and she will deeply infect your royal legacy." Liam stopped right beside the older man's intricately carved wooden chair. He looked down at the Duke with absolute, chilling emotional emptiness. "I am the law," Liam stated in a dangerously quiet, steady voice. Faster than any human I could track, Liam's right hand shot forward. He grabbed the arrogant Duke tightly by the collar of his expensive silk tunic. With one brutal, unforgiving motion, he slammed the man's face directly into the solid oak table. The sickening, loud crack of breaking bone echoed sharply through the completely silent hall. Fresh blood immediately sprayed across the polished wood and scattered official documents. Several proud lords gasped loudly and stumbled backward in sheer, unadulterated terror. For elite council guards instinctively drew their heavy, iron broadswords. Liam slowly and calmly drew his own massive blade with his free hand. His athletically built and handsome frame radiated pure, lethal violence in the bright room. "Take one more step," Liam warned the heavily armed, trembling guards. "And I will personally sever your heads from your useless shoulders." The terrified guards immediately dropped their heavy weapons to the stone floor. They knew perfectly well that the king was entirely unmatched in sheer physical combat. Liam turned his dark, intense attention back to the bleeding, whimpering Duke. He pressed the razor-sharp edge of his steel sword firmly against the man's exposed throat. "You called her dirt," Liam whispered, his low voice echoing clearly in the vast space. "But she holds vastly more worth in her little finger than your entire pathetic bloodline." Chloe stood perfectly still in the intense high brightness of the hall. Her beautiful and resilient spirit completely refused to let her look away from the gore. She knew this sudden, brutal violence was being committed entirely for her survival. It was a terrifying, deeply overwhelming display of absolute masculine protection. "From this moment forward, Chloe is under my direct, personal protection," Liam announced loudly. "Her spoken word carries the exact same weight as my own command." A collective, horrified shock rippled through the remaining, terrified nobility. "If any of you look at her with disrespect, you will lose your eyes. If any of you dare to speak ill of her, you will lose your tongues. And if anyone attempts to touch her, I will end your entire family line." He roughly pulled Duke Harrison back up by his ruined, bloody collar. The old man's nose was completely shattered, and dark blood poured heavily down his chin. "Do you understand me, Harrison?" Liam demanded with a cold, piercing glare. The broken Duke nodded frantically, tears of terrible pain streaming down his pale face. Liam shoved him backward in absolute, undeniable disgust. He sheathed his heavy sword with a sharp, ringing snap of cold steel. He walked calmly back across the floor to where Chloe was quietly waiting. The extreme high brightness of the grand room seemed to bend entirely around his dark presence. He gently took her small, trembling hand back into his own large grip. "This royal council is dismissed," Liam ordered the silent, thoroughly horrified room. No one dared to argue or hesitate for even a fraction of a second. The wealthy, powerful lords scrambled desperately toward the heavy wooden exit. They literally tripped over each other in their desperate haste to escape the king's violent wrath. Within mere moments, the massive hall was completely empty except for the two of them. Chloe looked up carefully at Liam's sharp, unapologetic, and blood-spattered profile. "You just made mortal enemies of the most powerful men in the entire country," she whispered softly. Liam looked down at her with a remarkably soft, tender expression that defied his previous brutality. "They were never my friends, my little bird," he replied with brutal honesty. "They only respected my overwhelming strength, and today I simply reminded them why." He gently wiped a microscopic speck of dust from her beautiful emerald velvet dress. "I told you I would burn this entire place down to keep you completely safe. I am fully prepared to light the match right now." Chloe realized with startling clarity that her life would never, ever be the same again. She was no longer just an invisible servant hiding in the dark, smoky kitchens. She was the sole weakness and the absolute greatest treasure of a very dangerous man. She took a deep, steadying breath, steeling her beautiful and resilient heart for the turbulent future. She would absolutely not let his monumental, bloody sacrifice be in vain. If she was going to stand beside this ruthless king, she had to become a queen in spirit. The clear, cinematic sunlight wrapped securely around them both like a warm, royal mantle. The first battle was definitively won with blood, but the real, treacherous war had just begun. They walked in complete silence away from the blood-stained great hall. Liam's grip on her hand remained firm and incredibly grounding. He guided her toward the royal solarium in the eastern wing of the vast estate. Clear, cinematic sunlight poured through the towering glass ceiling. The immense high brightness of the room illuminated the lush, exotic indoor gardens. It was a place of breathtaking wealth and quiet, absolute power. Chloe felt the soft emerald velvet of her gown brush elegantly against the polished marble floor. She was acutely aware of the terrified eyes watching them from the shadows of the corridors. The castle servants were already buzzing frantically with the shocking news of the morning. They reached a small, intricately wrought iron table set directly in the morning light. Liam pulled out a chair for her with the smooth grace of an athletically built and handsome conqueror. Chloe sat down carefully, her beautiful and resilient posture perfectly straight. She refused to let anyone see the residual trembling in her delicate hands. Within seconds, the heavy glass doors of the solarium opened with a soft click. Mrs. Dalton, the formidable and cruel head housekeeper, marched stiffly into the bright room. She was followed by 3 nervous maids carrying heavy silver breakfast trays. Only yesterday, Mrs. Dalton had brutally whipped Chloe's palms for dropping a simple wooden spoon. Now, the harsh older woman was forced to serve her former victim. Mrs. Dalton's face was a rigid, pale mask of barely concealed fury and disbelief. She directed the maids to place the extravagant food upon the sunlit table. She then picked up the heavy silver teapot with stiff, resentful movements. Mrs. Dalton poured a cup of steaming dark tea and placed it perfectly before the king. Then, she moved slightly to Chloe's side. Instead of pouring the tea, Mrs. Dalton intentionally slammed the empty porcelain cup down hard. She poured the boiling liquid carelessly, letting a splash of burning tea deliberately spill onto the saucer. It was a highly calculated, subtle insult meant to remind the kitchen girl of her low place. Mrs. Dalton stepped back with a faint, malicious smirk twisting her thin lips. She fully expected the frightened young maid to lower her head and accept the quiet humiliation. Liam immediately tensed beside the table. His golden eyes darkened instantly with a lethal, overwhelming promise of violence. He was entirely prepared to execute the housekeeper right there on the pristine marble floor. But Chloe gently placed her hand firmly over his large, scarred wrist. She stopped him with a single, calm touch. Her beautiful and resilient face remained utterly unreadable in the intense brightness. Chloe slowly picked up the delicate, overfilled teacup. She did not look at the steaming liquid, nor did she flinch from the heat. She maintained direct, unflinching eye contact with the arrogant head housekeeper. Without breaking her steady gaze, Chloe calmly tipped the cup over the edge of the table. The hot, dark tea splashed loudly across Mrs. Dalton's impeccably polished black leather shoes. The older woman gasped loudly in pure, unadulterated shock. "You spilled," Chloe stated in a remarkably quiet, steady voice. The clear, cinematic light highlighted the sudden, dangerous steel hiding in Chloe's eyes. "Clean the mess you made, Mrs. Dalton, and then pour me a proper cup." The 3 junior maids standing nearby stopped breathing entirely. The immense high brightness of the solarium suddenly felt suffocatingly tense. Mrs. Dalton's face flushed a violent, ugly shade of crimson. She looked desperately toward the king, silently begging for him to correct the insolent girl. But Liam simply leaned back comfortably in his iron chair. A slow, deeply satisfied smile spread across his sharply handsome features. His athletically built frame relaxed completely, signaling his absolute approval of the situation. "You heard my lady," Liam murmured, his deep voice vibrating with dangerous amusement. "Or perhaps you require my personal assistance to understand the order." The mere threat of his physical involvement drained the blood completely from Mrs. Dalton's face. She hastily grabbed a white linen napkin from the silver tray. With her hands shaking violently, the proud head housekeeper dropped heavily to her knees. She frantically wiped the spilled tea from the floor and from her own ruined shoes. Chloe watched her coldly, feeling a strange, intoxicating new power settling heavily in her chest. She realized survival here required much more than just a beautiful face and a king's favor. It required the absolute, ruthless willingness to crush those who tried to step on her. Mrs. Dalton scrambled back to her feet, completely humiliated and terrified. She poured a fresh cup of tea with meticulous, trembling care and placed it gently before Chloe. "Leave us," Chloe commanded softly, never raising her voice. The servants fled the bright room as quickly as their shaking legs could carry them. The heavy glass doors closed, leaving Chloe and Liam entirely alone in the blinding sunlight. Liam reached across the table and gently traced the rim of her pristine teacup. "You are exceptionally dangerous, my little bird," he praised in a low, husky whisper. Chloe finally took a slow, elegant sip of the perfect tea. Her beautiful and resilient spirit had fully accepted the terrifying rules of this new game. She was no longer hiding behind his massive, protective shadow. She was learning to cast her own. The afternoon sun was eventually replaced by the brilliant glare of 100 massive crystal chandeliers. They flooded Chloe's newly assigned royal chambers with a stunning, clear, cinematic light. The intense high brightness of the massive room left absolutely no dark corners for any cowards to hide within. Liam had been urgently summoned to the eastern courtyard just an hour ago. A sudden, highly suspicious military movement had been reported at the outer border walls. It was a blatant, calculated distraction designed entirely by the humiliated royal council. They desperately needed the powerful king away from his new weakness for just a few moments. Chloe paced nervously across the intricate, hand-woven Persian rugs. Her beautiful and resilient face was perfectly tense, her sharp instincts warning her of impending danger. She had survived the brutal, unforgiving castle kitchens by always anticipating the cruelty of others. Suddenly, The heavy iron lock on her chamber doors clicked shut from the outside. A chilling, profound silence immediately swallowed the bright, expansive room. Then, the towering glass doors leading to the stone balcony shattered inward with a deafening crash. 3 tall men entirely dressed in unmarked dark leather stepped over the broken glass. They held long, wicked steel daggers that gleamed dangerously in the cinematic light. There was no magical aura about them, only the cold, terrifying reality of trained human assassins. They moved toward her with the silent, deadly precision of professional killers. Chloe did not waste her precious breath on a useless, terrified scream. She knew perfectly well that the guards outside had either been bribed or murdered. Her beautiful and resilient spirit immediately took over her completely freezing body. She grabbed the massive, solid brass candlestick resting on the nearby marble table. The heavy metal weapon felt incredibly cold and reassuring in her small, trembling hands. The first assassin lunged forward, thrusting his sharp dagger directly toward her heart. Chloe violently twisted her body aside, narrowly avoiding the lethal, gleaming blade. She swung the heavy brass base with every single ounce of her desperate strength. The solid metal violently connected with the side of the assassin's head. A sickening crunch of bone echoed through the high brightness of the grand bedroom. The man collapsed to the floor instantly, dark blood rapidly pooling on the pristine rug. But the remaining 2 killers did not hesitate or slow their ruthless advance. One of them roughly grabbed her long, dark hair, throwing her brutally to the cold floor. The impact knocked the breath completely out of her fragile, aching lungs. The killer raised his heavy dagger high, perfectly silhouetted against the bright crystal light. Before the sharp blade could descend, the thick oak doors of the chamber completely exploded. The massive wooden panels were physically torn from their heavy iron hinges by sheer, unimaginable force. Liam burst into the room like a terrifying, unstoppable force of pure natural destruction. His heavy breathing was incredibly ragged, completely exposing the desperate speed of his return. He had recognized the pathetic border distraction and ridden his warhorse to the brink of death to get back. His athletically built and handsome frame was radiating an absolutely terrifying level of murderous intent. He did not draw his heavy royal sword from its leather sheath. He threw himself directly at the assassin standing aggressively over Chloe. Liam's large, scarred hands clamped violently around the killer's thick neck. With one effortless, brutally savage twist, he snapped the man's cervical spine completely. The horrific, sharp crack sounded like a dry branch breaking in a silent winter forest. The final assassin panicked completely, dropping his weapon and scrambling desperately toward the broken balcony. Liam crossed the bright room in 3 massive, incredibly powerful strides. He grabbed the fleeing man by his heavy leather belt and hurled him backward into the stone wall. The sheer, devastating physical impact shattered the assassin's ribs instantly. Liam stood slowly over the broken, gasping man in the blinding, clear light. His athletically built and handsome features were tightly twisted into a mask of pure, unforgiving wrath. He calmly placed his heavy, ironclad boot directly over the man's crushing chest. He applied all of his immense body weight until the assassin stopped moving entirely. The grand, brilliantly lit room fell into a heavy, blood-soaked silence once more. Liam immediately dropped heavily to his knees beside Chloe on the ruined floor. His terrifying, violent demeanor vanished instantly as he reached out for her. He pulled her shaking, fragile body tightly against his broad, completely impenetrable chest. "I am here," he whispered fiercely into her dark hair. "I have you." Chloe buried her beautiful and resilient face deeply into his protective embrace. She inhaled the comforting, masculine scent of leather, steel, and a faint hint of sweat. She had fought incredibly hard, but the overwhelming relief of his arrival finally brought tears to her eyes. Liam gently wiped a small smear of the assassin's blood from her pale, soft cheek. His piercing golden eyes stared blankly at the 3 dead bodies ruining the bright room. The noble council had officially crossed the final, unforgivable line of no return. They had foolishly tried to take the only thing in the world that mattered to the king. "Get dressed for riding," Liam commanded softly, his voice echoing with cold, absolute finality. "We are not staying in this infected, treacherous castle tonight." Chloe looked up at him, her heart pounding wildly against her ribs. "Where are we going?" she asked quietly, trusting him completely with her very life. "To the High Fortress," Liam replied, carefully helping her back to her feet. "Because tomorrow, I am going to slaughter every single nobleman who signed that order." The clear, cinematic sunlight of the afternoon had proven entirely incapable of stopping the darkness. But Liam's terrifying, absolute devotion was a completely different kind of fire. It was a ruthless, unyielding inferno that was about to burn the entire old world to the ground. The heavy iron gates of the capital city slammed shut behind them with a definitive, ringing finality. Clear, cinematic sunlight washed over the rugged, untamed landscape spreading out before their galloping horse. The immense high brightness of the open plains offered absolutely no concealment for anyone trying to follow them. Liam rode a massive, midnight black warhorse that matched his own imposing, lethal presence perfectly. He held Chloe securely in front of him, entirely shielding her fragile body from the biting wind. His athletically built and handsome frame acted as an impenetrable fortress of solid muscle and terrifying warmth. Chloe leaned her aching back against his broad chest, feeling the steady, reassuring thud of his racing heart. Her beautiful and resilient spirit completely refused to succumb to the overwhelming exhaustion threatening to drag her down. They had been riding at a punishing, relentless pace for hours without a single moment of rest. The treacherous royal council would undoubtedly send their most elite, ruthless trackers to hunt them down. Liam suddenly pulled tightly on the thick leather reins, bringing the massive warhorse to an abrupt halt. They had reached the edge of a deep, rocky gorge that served as the natural border to the high territories. The harsh, extreme high brightness of the midday sun illuminated every sharp, jagged rock in the dangerous canyon below. "We have company," Liam stated in a dangerously quiet voice, his sharp eyes scanning the rugged horizon. Chloe immediately tensed, her delicate hands gripping the thick leather of the saddle with white-knuckled fear. 6 heavily armed mercenaries emerged slowly from the shadows of the massive boulders blocking the narrow mountain pass. They wore unmarked chainmail and carried heavy steel crossbows already loaded with lethal, armor-piercing bolts. These were clearly not standard castle guards, but expensive, hardened killers hired secretly by the wealthy nobility. Liam did not show even a single fraction of fear or hesitation in the face of the deadly ambush. He dismounted the tall horse with the terrifying, lethal grace of an apex predator completely ready to strike. "Stay exactly where you are," he ordered Chloe softly, his golden eyes burning with an intense, protective fury. There was absolutely no magical aura surrounding him, only the terrifying reality of his absolute, supreme physical mastery. The first mercenary raised his heavy crossbow, aiming directly at the king's exposed, unarmored chest. Before the killer could even pull the heavy trigger, Liam closed the vast distance between them with explosive speed. He drew his heavy broadsword in one fluid, continuous motion, the cold steel flashing brilliantly in the sunlight. With a single, devastatingly powerful swing, Liam severed the heavy crossbow and the mercenary's hands entirely. A blood-curdling scream echoed violently through the silent gorge, but Liam was already moving to the next target. His athletically built and handsome form was a terrifying blur of calculated, uncompromising violence and pure destruction. He ducked under a desperate spear thrust, driving his heavy armored elbow directly into the attacker's unprotected throat. The sickening crunch of collapsing cartilage was entirely audible even over the panicked shouting of the remaining men. Chloe watched in breathless, paralyzed awe as the man who loved her ruthlessly dismantled the elite killers. She forced her beautiful and resilient mind to stay entirely focused on his incredible, overwhelming physical dominance. 2 mercenaries attempted to flank him simultaneously, drawing long, jagged hunting knives from their heavy belts. Liam caught the first man's wrist, twisting it brutally until the bone shattered completely through the pale skin. He then used the screaming man as a physical human shield to block the second attacker's desperate, plunging blade. With a heavy, ironclad boot, Liam kicked the final standing mercenary directly in the center of his chest. The sheer, unimaginable physical force threw the heavy man backward into a solid granite wall, killing him instantly. In less than 60 seconds, the bloody, uneven skirmish was entirely and definitively over. The intense, clear cinematic light shone down harshly on the brutal aftermath of the completely failed assassination attempt. Liam stood alone among the broken bodies, his heavy sword dripping thick, dark blood onto the dry earth. He wiped the razor-sharp steel clean on a dead man's tunic before calmly sliding it back into its leather sheath. He walked slowly back to the waiting horse, his dangerous, ragged breathing gradually returning to a steady rhythm. There was no remorse in his sharp, handsome features, only a chilling, absolute determination to protect his own. "Are you injured?" Liam asked gently, his deep voice immediately softening the moment he looked up at Chloe. Chloe shook her head slowly, her wide eyes locked entirely on his blood-spattered, incredibly striking face. "They will never stop sending people to kill us," she whispered, the cold reality of their situation fully setting in. Liam reached up and gently rested his large, incredibly warm hand against her soft, pale cheek. "Let them send entire armies, my little bird," he replied, his tone filled with a terrifying, absolute confidence. "I will simply build a mountain of their broken bones to ensure you never have to hide again." He swung himself effortlessly back into the heavy leather saddle, wrapping his strong arms securely around her waist. He spurred the massive warhorse forward, leaving the bloody, silent gorge far behind them in the rising dust. The journey up the steep, winding mountain path was incredibly treacherous and physically demanding. The temperature dropped rapidly as they ascended higher into the unforgiving, brutally rocky peaks. Yet, the clear, cinematic sunlight continued to bathe them in a stark, beautifully high brightness. Chloe could deeply feel the immense physical toll the continuous riding was taking on Liam's massive body. Even an athletically built and handsome warrior required rest, though he would absolutely never admit it to her. She reached down and gently placed her small, warm hands over his large, calloused fingers holding the tight reins. It was a tiny, entirely silent gesture of profound gratitude and deeply growing affection. Liam tightened his possessive grip around her waist slightly in immediate, powerful wordless acknowledgement. The towering, impenetrable walls of the high fortress finally appeared on the distant, heavily sunlit horizon. It was a brutal, ancient stronghold built entirely for endless war and absolute, unyielding survival. The massive iron gates of the fortress slowly ground open with a heavy, deafening metallic screech. A small, fiercely loyal garrison of heavily scarred veteran soldiers stood at absolute attention in the dusty courtyard. They did not question their king's sudden arrival or the beautiful, exhausted woman securely in his massive arms. These elite men were completely loyal to Liam's strength alone, completely uncaring of the distant council's weak politics. Liam finally dismounted, carefully lifting Chloe down from the towering horse as if she were made of fragile glass. Her legs trembled violently from the arduous journey, but she forced herself to stand tall and perfectly straight. She would show these hardened warriors exactly why their terrifying king had chosen her above all others. The intense high brightness of the late afternoon sun cast long, dramatic shadows across the ancient stone courtyard. Chloe leaned her head back against his shoulder, fully accepting the incredibly dangerous, violent path they were on. Her beautiful and resilient heart finally understood that peaceful submission was absolutely never going to be an option. They had finally reached their impenetrable sanctuary, but the ultimate war for the bloody throne was still rapidly approaching. She was the chosen queen of a ruthless, unstoppable warlord, and she would learn to rule over the ashes with him. The clear, cinematic sunlight poured heavily through the narrow, defensive stone windows of the high war room. The intense high brightness powerfully illuminated the massive, circular oak table covered entirely in intricate military maps. Liam stood completely silent over the scattered parchment, his broad shoulders deeply tense with absolute, heavy responsibility. His athletically built and handsome frame cast a long, immensely commanding shadow directly across the detailed terrain models. He had not slept a single moment since their bloody, desperate arrival at the ancient, impenetrable high fortress. Chloe quietly pushed open the heavy, iron-bound door, her soft footsteps echoing faintly in the vast, quiet space. She moved with a quiet, undeniable physical grace that perfectly matched her beautiful and resilient spirit. She carried a simple silver tray holding hot tea and fresh bread for the severely exhausted king. Liam immediately looked up, his fierce, calculating expression softening entirely the exact moment he saw her. He gently took the heavy tray from her small hands and set it aside without a single, passing glance. He pulled her securely against his solid chest, burying his face deeply into her dark, incredibly fragrant hair. "You should be resting," Liam murmured softly, his deep voice vibrating with profound, fiercely protective affection. "I cannot possibly sleep while you are entirely consumed by the logistics of this coming war," Chloe replied honestly. She pulled back slightly to look down at the incredibly complex, heavily marked architectural maps of the capital city. "The noble council has heavily barricaded themselves deeply inside the main palace walls," Liam explained quietly. "They command the heavy royal guard and possess enough hoarded food to easily survive a bitter, endless winter. A direct, brutal physical siege will cost the lives of thousands of my most fiercely loyal soldiers." He traced a large, calloused finger over the impenetrable, towering main iron gate of the capital on the map. "Their defensive position is incredibly strong, built completely upon sheer, overwhelming stone fortifications and archer towers." Chloe stared intently at the highly detailed drawing of the massive castle she had literally scrubbed for years. Her beautiful and resilient mind immediately began to process the familiar, deeply ingrained architecture of her former prison. She had spent her entire difficult life quietly navigating the dark, forgotten, invisible corners of that sprawling estate. "They are deeply arrogant, foolish men who completely ignore what they consider far beneath their high status," Chloe stated clearly. Liam raised an intrigued, sharp eyebrow, giving her his complete, undivided, and highly respectful attention in the bright room. "You are looking strictly at the grand gates and the main, heavily guarded merchant roads," she pointed out softly. She reached out and placed her delicate finger firmly on a blank, entirely unmarked section of the eastern wall. "There is a massive, ancient drainage system located directly beneath the old, soot-stained royal kitchens. It is a wide, completely unmapped stone tunnel used only to flush heavy wastewater into the lower river. The iron security grates rusted completely away a decade ago, and the arrogant council never bothered to spend gold repairing them. Because a wealthy, powerful nobleman would absolutely never lower himself to crawl through the foul mud and soot." Liam stared at her, his piercing golden eyes widening slightly in sheer, unadulterated strategic shock. "Are you telling me there is a completely open, unguarded physical path directly into the absolute heart of the palace?" he asked slowly. "It leads straight into the lower storage vaults, entirely bypassing the heavy outer walls and the armed garrison," Chloe confirmed confidently. "I used to hide down there in the dark when Mrs. Dalton was actively looking for someone to viciously punish." The clear, cinematic sunlight perfectly highlighted the brilliant, incredibly dangerous smile that slowly spread across Liam's face. His athletically built and handsome features were completely illuminated by this sudden, massive, game-changing tactical revelation. He did not need to sacrifice thousands of brave men in a brutal, bloody, and prolonged frontal assault against heavy stone. He only needed a small, highly lethal strike team to physically infiltrate the absolute center of the enemy's sleeping stronghold. He gently cupped Chloe's soft face in his large, scarred hands, looking at her with overwhelming, absolute reverence. You are absolutely extraordinary, my little bird, Liam whispered, his voice thick with raw, undisguised emotion and profound respect. You have just directly handed me the master key to completely dismantle my greatest, most entrenched political enemies. He leaned down and kissed her with a fierce, burning passion that stole the very breath directly from her lungs. It was not merely a kiss of desperate protection or simple physical lust, but one of profound, absolute equal partnership. Chloe kissed him back fiercely, her beautiful and resilient heart soaring effortlessly in the bright, sunlit room. She was no longer just the fragile, broken maid he had violently rescued from the cold, blood-stained bedroom floor. She was rapidly becoming his vital, indispensable strategist, the quiet, highly intelligent architect of his ultimate, bloody victory. Liam pulled back slowly, resting his forehead gently against hers in the stark, extreme high brightness of the war room. We strike tonight under the absolute, impenetrable cover of total darkness, Liam declared with chilling, lethal certainty. I will personally lead my best men through those forgotten tunnels and drag the council violently from their warm beds. Chloe felt a sudden, sharp thrill of terrifying, electric anticipation rush completely through her veins. She had suffered silently under the cruel, unforgiving heavy boots of those wealthy men for her entire, miserable life. Now, she had personally drawn the lethal, invisible map that would bring their arrogant, corrupt empire permanently crashing down. I am going with you, Chloe stated firmly, entirely refusing to be left behind in the distant safety of the high fortress. Liam initially tensed, his overwhelmingly powerful masculine instinct to protect her warring directly with his deep respect for her strength. He looked deeply into her unwavering eyes, seeing the brilliant, beautiful, and resilient fire burning brightly within her soul. He knew she profoundly needed to witness the complete, definitive, physical end of the monsters who had ruthlessly tormented her. You will stay directly by my side, and you will absolutely not leave my sight for a single second, Liam finally agreed. He kissed her forehead with a gentle, yet incredibly fierce physical promise of absolute, uncompromising safety. The intense, clear cinematic light of the afternoon slowly began to shift into the deeper, highly dangerous shadows of dusk. The ultimate, entirely physical war for the absolute control of the bloody kingdom was no longer a distant, approaching storm. It was a precise, highly calculated steel blade aimed directly at the exposed throat of the arrogant ruling class. And it was the former, lowly kitchen maid who held the heavy handle of the knife entirely steady in her own hands. The midnight air was sharp and bitterly cold against their freezing skin. Liam led the silent, heavily armed strike team toward the hidden eastern wall of the massive capital. They slipped completely unnoticed past the heavily armored outer perimeter patrols. Chloe guided them flawlessly to the overgrown, forgotten entrance of the ancient drainage system. The heavy iron security grate had indeed completely rusted away into useless, jagged flakes. They moved quickly and incredibly quietly through the damp, dark stone tunnel beneath the city. Liam kept Chloe securely positioned directly behind his broad, impenetrable, and highly protective back. His athletically built and handsome frame navigated the tight, filthy space with surprising, lethal agility. They soon reached the heavy wooden door leading directly into the lower royal storage vaults. Liam shattered the old iron lock with a single, brutally muffled strike from the heavy pommel of his sword. They stepped swiftly out of the damp darkness and directly into the lower levels of the Grand Palace. Immediately, they were met with an overwhelming, blinding flood of clear, cinematic light. The wealthy nobles had desperately demanded thousands of massive wax candles and oil lamps remain burning at all times. They were deeply terrified of the dark shadows and the looming, inevitable threat of their ousted king. This resulting extreme high brightness violently illuminated every polished marble hallway and heavy gilded doorway. It created a stark, unforgiving, and incredibly brilliant stage for the absolute slaughter that was about to unfold. Liam signaled his elite veteran soldiers with a single, sharp, and highly calculated gesture of his scarred hand. The ruthless warriors instantly fanned out, systematically neutralizing the surprised inner palace guards. There was absolutely no magical power involved in this precise infiltration, only the supreme reality of human tactical violence. There was no chaotic shouting, only the quiet, terrifying sounds of heavy steel finding its ultimate mark. Chloe walked purposefully beside Liam, her beautiful and resilient spirit completely focused on the final objective. She did not flinch or look away in horror as the pristine white floors became heavily slick with fresh, dark blood. They rapidly ascended the grand, sweeping marble staircase toward the heavily fortified royal council chambers. The massive, solid oak doors were firmly barred from the inside with impossibly thick iron beams. Liam did not hesitate to completely utilize his sheer, unimaginable, and overwhelming physical strength. He drove his heavy, ironclad boot directly into the center of the carved wood with a deafening, thunderous crash. The thick iron defensive beams splintered instantly and completely shattered under the devastating, brutal impact. The massive doors flew violently open, slamming incredibly hard against the interior stone walls. A brilliant, blinding wave of clear, cinematic sunlight from the massive decorative crystal chandeliers washed over them. The absolute high brightness of the opulent, oversized room perfectly exposed the sheer, naked terror of the gathered nobility. Duke Harrison and his wealthy, corrupt co-conspirators had been frantically debating their completely failing defensive strategy. Now, they simply stared in horrified, entirely paralyzed disbelief at the waking nightmare standing right in their doorway. Liam stepped slowly and deliberately into the grand chamber, his heavy broadsword drawn and dripping ominously. His athletically built and handsome features were tightly twisted into a cold, merciless mask of pure vengeance. There was no hesitation in his powerful stride, completely devoid of any bulky, monstrous awkwardness. "Good evening, my lords," Liam whispered, his deep, terrifyingly calm voice echoing clearly over their panicked gasps. Chloe stepped confidently out from behind his massive shadow, standing proudly and firmly as his absolute equal. Her elegant emerald velvet dress was heavily stained with the dark dirt of the lower tunnels. Yet, her beautiful and resilient posture remained absolutely flawless and terrifyingly regal in the bright light. She looked down coldly at the trembling, pathetic men who had once treated her as completely invisible, disposable trash. Duke Harrison stumbled backward in sheer terror, his previously broken, heavily bandaged face draining entirely of color. "Guards!" the arrogant Duke shrieked desperately, his voice cracking violently with sheer, unadulterated panic. "Your guards are currently bleeding to death on the lower marble floors," Liam informed him with brutal, unwavering honesty. He quickly closed the vast distance between himself and the trembling nobility with the terrifying speed of a hunting predator. Two desperate, foolish lords suddenly drew their ornate, entirely useless ceremonial swords and lunged toward the king. Liam easily and effortlessly parried their incredibly weak strikes with a single, casual movement of his wrist. He followed through by severing their hands with two brutally efficient, lightning-fast swings of his heavy steel blade. Their agonizing, horrific screams completely shattered the heavy, tense silence of the intensely bright room. The remaining aristocratic nobles dropped heavily to their knees instantly, weeping and begging pathetically for their miserable lives. Liam walked slowly and methodically toward Duke Harrison, the heavy, blood-soaked steel of his sword scraping ominously. "You dared to threaten my queen," Liam stated coldly, the absolute finality in his dark tone freezing the very air in their lungs. He reached out and roughly grabbed the completely terrified Duke tightly by his expensive, imported silk collar. He lifted the old man completely off the polished marble floor with just one powerful, heavily scarred hand. "And I specifically promised you that I would tear down this entire kingdom just to keep her completely safe." Chloe watched this brutal, necessary execution of justice with a profoundly calm, incredibly steady heart. She knew deeply that this extreme, unapologetic violence was the only language these cruel, selfish men truly understood. Liam did not generously offer the disgraced nobleman a quick, relatively honorable death by the sharp edge of a sword. He simply used his bare, immensely powerful hands to physically break the old man's neck with a sickening, highly audible snap. He carelessly and disgustedly dropped the lifeless, heavy body directly onto the immensely expensive Persian rug. He then turned his piercing, golden eyes slowly toward the aggressively sobbing, utterly broken survivors of the council. This ruling council is permanently and entirely dissolved as of this very second, Liam announced to the terrified room. Any man here who refuses to swear absolute, unquestioning loyalty to Queen Chloe will immediately join Harrison on the floor. The broken, wealthy lords instantly pressed their foreheads directly against the cold, heavily blooded marble in total submission. They completely and instantly surrendered their ancient wealth, their hollow pride, and their pathetic, cowardly lives to the conqueror. Liam turned slowly away from the groveling, weeping men, his dark, violently aggressive aura softening instantly. He walked calmly back to Chloe's side, gently taking her small, remarkably steady hand in his own massive grip. The intense high brightness of the grand room seemed to focus entirely on their deeply intertwined fingers. The brutal, incredibly bloody physical war for the entire capital city had been definitively won in less than a single hour. Chloe had successfully used her darkest, most painful childhood memories to expertly forge the very weapon of their victory. She looked up carefully into his striking, incredibly handsome face, feeling an overwhelming, profound sense of deep belonging. They had violently and ruthlessly ripped the entire corrupt world apart simply to find and fiercely protect each other. There were still many massive, heavily armed bodies to physically clear away and a completely broken government to rebuild. But as they stood victorious in the clear, cinematic light of the conquered throne room, they were truly untouchable. She had successfully survived the harsh, freezing winters shivering in the dark, soot-filled castle scullery. She had silently endured the brutal, daily cruelty of the High Court's incredibly arrogant upper servants. Now, she was the absolute, completely undisputed ruler of the very men who had once entirely ignored her tragic existence. Liam gently wiped a tiny, microscopic smear of dark soot from her smooth, beautifully pale cheek with his thumb. His touch was incredibly tender, creating a massive, staggering contrast to the horrific violence he had just unleashed. The heavy, distinct metallic scent of fresh human blood hung thickly in the incredibly bright, totally stagnant air. Yet, Chloe felt only a deep, entirely resounding peace settling firmly and permanently within her racing chest. The old, deeply rotting foundations of the highly corrupt kingdom had been violently torn away tonight. They would absolutely build a new, infinitely stronger empire directly upon these very same bloody ashes. It would be a mighty kingdom governed exclusively by raw strength, unyielding loyalty, and their profound bond. The remaining veteran elite soldiers quietly and efficiently secured the wide perimeter of the grand, bright chamber. They moved strictly with absolute, highly disciplined precision, deeply respecting the monumental shift in power. No hardened warrior dared to question the lowly maid who now stood confidently as their supreme, unquestioned queen. Her beautiful and resilient nature had definitively proven to be the ultimate, completely decisive strategic advantage in this war. Liam slowly guided her carefully toward the massive, heavily gilded double thrones situated at the very head of the room. The clear, cinematic light reflected brilliantly off the polished, cold gold and the deeply rich, dark velvet cushions. He absolutely did not sit down on his own designated, traditional seat of overwhelming, absolute masculine power. Instead, he gently but incredibly firmly pressed Chloe down into the main, dominant throne of the entire realm. He then knelt slowly and purposefully before her right on the ruined, blood-stained marble floor. He bowed his dark head in total, absolute reverence under the extreme high brightness of the falling empire. It was the ultimate, absolute display of physical devotion from the most profoundly dangerous man in the known world. Several quiet, remarkably peaceful months had definitively passed since the brutal, bloody night of the Great Reckoning in the Grand Palace. The ancient, towering capital city had been completely and fundamentally transformed from the inside out under their new, absolute rule. Clear, cinematic sunlight streamed heavily through the massive, newly installed arched glass windows of the supreme royal bedchamber. The immense, overwhelming high brightness of the crisp morning beautifully illuminated a massive room completely devoid of fear, shadows, or hidden enemies. Chloe lay perfectly still beneath the heavy, imported silk blankets, her breathing incredibly deep, miraculously steady, and wonderfully relaxed. Her beautifully young, stunning, and deeply resilient face was pressed directly against a highly familiar chest of warm, solid muscle. King Liam breathed in a profoundly calm, rhythmic, deeply hypnotic pattern just beneath her quietly resting head. He undeniably remained an alpha of strikingly sharp, intensely handsome features and a perfectly, flawlessly athletically built frame. There was absolutely no bulky, grotesque, or monstrous exaggeration to the immense, highly lethal physical strength he naturally possessed. Instead, he simply radiated the quiet, absolute, and deeply terrifying security of an undisputed, supreme ruler who had completely conquered his entire world. Chloe slowly opened her large, expressive eyes, allowing the brilliantly bright, wonderfully warming sunlight to wash completely over her delicate, pale skin. She was absolutely no longer the incredibly invisible, constantly terrified kitchen maid who had spent her days scrubbing heavy, black soot from the cold stone hearths. She was now the supreme, entirely unquestioned queen of a rapidly expanding, fiercely loyal, and heavily militarized new empire. The heavy, incredibly expensive silk sheets draped elegantly over their resting bodies were a rich, pristine white, completely replacing the dark, bloody memories of the violent past. Liam's large, heavily scarred, and immensely powerful arm was wrapped securely and highly possessively around her incredibly narrow, delicate waist. Even in his absolute deepest, most profoundly peaceful sleep, his deeply ingrained protective instincts remained entirely active and violently, terrifyingly alert to any physical threat. Outside the heavy, massively reinforced oak doors of their private sanctuary, the highly elite, heavily armed veteran guards stood in absolute, unwavering, and deeply respectful silence. They were the exact same hardened, ruthlessly efficient men who had previously followed them blindly and faithfully into the deadly, dark underground tunnels of the castle. No arrogant, wealthy duke or cruel, intensely vindictive housekeeper would ever dare to march arrogantly down these bright, newly polished marble halls ever again. The entirely corrupt, deeply prejudiced ruling council had been permanently, violently erased from the incredibly long, highly bloody history of the powerful kingdom. Their deeply ancient, heavily hoarded wealth had been completely and entirely redistributed to massively strengthen the fiercely loyal, highly disciplined royal army. Chloe gently and incredibly slowly shifted her slight weight, lightly trailing her wonderfully small, soft fingers across Liam's broad, immensely powerful shoulder. She quietly marveled at the profoundly difficult, overwhelmingly dangerous journey they had somehow miraculously survived together against all incredibly impossible, deadly odds. He had quite literally and physically burned a deeply corrupt, entirely rotten political system completely to the ground just to keep her absolutely, unequivocally safe. He had willingly, without a single moment of hesitation, become a terrifying, unstoppable monster to the wealthy noble class so he could permanently be her ultimate, perfect sanctuary. A deeply resonant, powerfully rumbling vibration slowly began to echo wonderfully through his flawlessly athletically built and incredibly handsome torso. Liam's intensely piercing, incredibly sharp golden eyes fluttered slowly open, immediately, and instinctively locking directly onto her profoundly beautiful and resilient face. His intense gaze was absolutely not filled with the cold, highly lethal violence of a ruthless warlord, but with a profound, completely absolute, and deeply overwhelming adoration. "You are awake incredibly early this morning, my beautiful queen," Liam murmured softly, his incredibly deep, wonderfully husky voice sounding incredibly gentle and profoundly tender in the quiet room. "I was simply watching the beautiful morning light fill our room," Chloe replied honestly, her own soft voice completely steady, deeply contented, and completely devoid of any past trauma or fear. The intensely bright, perfectly clear cinematic light perfectly caught the heavy, intricately forged solid gold bands matching perfectly on their respective left hands. The entire, massive kingdom is completely and totally at peace this beautiful morning, Liam stated firmly, gently pulling her even closer to his immense, incredibly comforting body heat. Because they finally know exactly what will horribly happen if they ever foolishly dare to disturb our peaceful rest ever again, Chloe smiled incredibly softly, her bright eyes shining with quiet, unyielding power. It was absolutely no longer an empty, desperate, or heavily panicked threat, but an absolute, completely undeniable physical law deeply written in the spilled noble blood of their completely defeated enemies. The brutal, highly destructive physical war for absolute survival, supreme political power, and ultimate, unquestioned respect was definitively, entirely, and permanently over. She had completely and utterly outlasted the incredibly cruel older women who had physically beaten her and the terribly arrogant, wealthy men who had entirely ignored her very existence. She had fiercely, beautifully, and completely claimed her absolute rightful place directly beside the absolute most dangerous, incredibly powerful man in the entire vast realm. Liam reached up slowly and gently threaded his incredibly large, heavily calloused fingers entirely through her beautifully long, wonderfully dark, incredibly soft hair. I promised you long ago that I would physically build a completely new, infinitely better world perfectly suited strictly for you, he whispered with immense, entirely unyielding, and absolute conviction. And you absolutely have, my king, Chloe answered profoundly, resting her smooth cheek wonderfully comfortably back against the incredibly steady, reassuring rhythm of his wildly beating heart. The immense, incredibly stunning high brightness of the morning sun firmly promised a remarkably long, completely secure, and heavily, violently protected future for them both. There would absolutely be no more desperate, panicked running, absolutely no more terrified hiding, and absolutely no more freezing or violently shivering in the completely dark, painfully cold castle kitchens. They had successfully forged an incredibly unbreakable, profoundly deep emotional and physical bond directly through extreme, brutal violence, highly desperate trust, and absolute, entirely unyielding devotion. He was her completely invincible, heavily armed, and totally impenetrable physical shield directly against the incredibly cruel, completely unforgiving harshness of the treacherous outside world. And she was his brilliantly strategic, highly intelligent, and beautifully resilient emotional anchor to absolute, wonderful humanity and deeply profound, lasting peace. Together, they definitively ruled the magnificent, incredibly bright new era directly from the absolute highest, most heavily secured, and deeply impenetrable peak of the entire kingdom. Chloe closed her beautiful eyes once more, happily letting the wonderfully clear, flawlessly cinematic sunlight warm her completely and entirely down to her very resilient soul. She was definitively the incredibly dangerous Alpha King's absolute ultimate, most fiercely and violently guarded treasure, resting perfectly peacefully upon his immensely powerful chest. And the entire, incredibly vast world finally and permanently knew that to ever dare wake her was to instantly invite the absolute, total, and completely unavoidable destruction of absolutely everything. Chloe's journey from a soot-covered maid to a queen who commands the absolute respect of those who once despised her is the ultimate form of poetic justice. King Liam didn't just offer her a place by his side, he built a new empire upon the literal ashes of the old world to ensure she would never have to hide in the shadows again. Now that the dust has settled in this cinematic, sun-drenched new era, which moment of the story felt the most rewarding to you? Was it seeing the cruel Mrs. Dalton, who once whipped Chloe for a simple mistake, forced to her knees to scrub tea off the floor in total humiliation? Or was it the moment Liam declared war on his own powerful nobility, promising to burn the entire castle to the ground, just to protect Chloe's right to sleep in peace? Would you desire this kind of unyielding inferno of devotion, or does the king's lethal, possessive protection feel a bit too intense for your taste? Let us know your thoughts in the comments.